In 2016, the territorial disputes in the South China Sea will continue to remain the focus of attention. An important decision by the International Tribunal is expected, one that will greatly influence the dispute. China's economic slowdown will lead to lower metal prices, which will have enormous consequences for commodity-producing countries. Furthermore, in India, the country will remain one of the fastest-growing economies in the world, but the security issues with neighboring Pakistan will continue. Security will also play a big role in Libya, where the lack of a government will turn the country into a gateway for foreign fighters and arms headed for Central Africa. Aside this, a number of African nations will stand on the brink of civil war. But not everything is bad. In South America, Colombia is well on its way to peacefully settle a 50-year insurgency, and the new government of Argentina will begin addressing its financial problems through negotiations. Further north, the American public will continue the debate on racial violence, but the biggest issue for the United States will be the growing challenges to its status as the world's sole superpower. In this prognosis, we will go over the most likely diplomatic, economic, and military outcomes for East and Southeast Asia, Africa, and South and North America in 2016. Welcome to a Caspian Report by me, Shirvan. We start the prognosis right where we left off in North Africa. Following the collapse of the al-Gaddafi government in 2011, Libya has been in a state of anarchy. 2016 promises nothing good for the country. At the moment, Libya is governed by two rival factions, Tripoli and Tobruk, who are in UN-led peace talks. Since most international oil companies prefer to cooperate with Tripoli, the Tobruk faction will gradually have to make concessions with its Tripoli rivals. Yet, the negotiations will yield no results this year. At the backdrop of the peace talks, the country is being ravaged by militias and tribes who are fighting for power and control. The rule of law has ceased to exist. Crime and violence are at an all-time high, and the judicial system has collapsed. In 2014 and 15, the lack of a government turned Libya into a transit hub for refugees and migrants trying to reach Europe. In 2016, Libya will become a transit hub for arms trade and ISIS militants headed for Lake Chad region and beyond. This new supply route of fighters and arms will strengthen the position of Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab. So in 2016, we will see even more activity from these two militant organizations. What's more is that the epicenter of their activities will remain Nigeria and Somalia respectively, but the area of operations for Boko Haram will expand into neighboring countries such as Niger, Chad, and Cameroon. For Al-Shabaab, the operations will further expand into neighboring Kenya and Ethiopia. Equally important is that the local leaders will fail to stop the organizations or even address the factors behind the radicalization, such as corruption, political alienation, rapid population growth, environmental degradation, etc. South Sudan will be one of the few countries unaffected by these radical groups. However, the country will face its own very unique problem in 2016. The peace agreement between the government and the largest armed opposition group is on the brink of collapse. Decades-long independence struggle has left South Sudan with dozens of rival armed groups. Since 2013, more than 2.4 million people have been displaced, and tens of thousands have been killed. And with more than 24 armed groups, the prospects of a full-fledged civil war in 2016 is becoming a reality. In the 1960s and 80s, the dictators in Africa used direct force to rule. In 2016, the game will change. Rather than force, the local rulers will prefer to legalize their indefinite rule by adjusting the constitution. An example of this is President Sassou Nguesso of the Republic of Congo. In 2015, he adjusted the term limit in the constitution, which will allow for his re-election in 2016. This tactic is and will be used by many Central African nations such as Uganda, Rwanda, and Angola. Most rulers will get away with this due to the weak opposition forces, but not everyone. Two countries in particular will face an armed rebellion. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, President Kabila's attempt to rewrite the constitution has created a lot of opposition. In 2016, sporadic violence throughout the country is expected. The same story goes for Burundi, only worse. Ever since the third re-election of President Nkurunziza, the situation has escalated. Hundreds of civilians have been killed and more than 200,000 people have fled the country. The UN is expecting a dramatic escalation with catastrophic violence. The thing is, even though the crisis is more political than ethnic, some politicians are exploiting the ethnic divisions. If these exploitations and the violence continue, we will see a civil war in Burundi. The situation in East Africa is somewhat more stable. Tanzania will spend most of the year negotiating for energy contracts, whilst Mozambique will negotiate for the reconciliation of the government and the opposition forces. South Africa will see its currency decline in value. This decline will indirectly lead to a tense situation in the mining sector, which is heavily affected by the current low metal prices. The low metal prices, which will play an important role for 2016, brings us to a different continent, East Asia. As China's economic growth slows down, so too does the prices of metals. A direct result of this will be cheaper commodities throughout the world, which is great for consumers but dreadful for mining and commodity producing sectors. In 2016, China will continue a long list of reforms, including the aspiration to establish an economic model based on domestic consumption rather than exportation. Over the years, Beijing has made significant progress on this, but the reforms have reached a difficult phase due to the low metal prices. At the moment, in some coastal provinces, domestic consumption has increased, but in some inland provinces, the industrial sector has taken a hit. Despite the setbacks, the leadership in Beijing will go ahead with the reforms. An equally big change for China will be the military reforms. The People's Liberation Army will undergo enormous structural changes to bring it in line with Western military models. The military reforms will drastically reduce the number of personnel, reorganize the military regions, and re-educate the lower echelons of the military. However, as the reforms decrease the influence of the army in the political arena, the threat of a military takeover increases. This is the reason why the government in Beijing will move forward with extreme caution. More important than the Chinese reforms, the focus of attention in Southeast and East Asia will revolve around the territorial disputes in the South China Sea. China's continuous large-scale construction of artificial islands in the South China Sea is already turning into a naval competition between the United States and China. Washington will continue their military demonstrations in the disputed waters. However, rather than a direct confrontation, the United States will seek to use the regional nations of Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia, and even Vietnam to counter the growing naval presence of Beijing. This is evident from the financial support package worth about $259 million to these countries. This package is really meant to bolster the naval capabilities of these countries, but an even bigger American arms deal is expected with Taiwan. What's more is that over the course of 2016, we will see the South China Sea dispute escalate. Even passive countries such as Japan will become entangled in this dispute. The South China Sea is one of the most important sea trading routes in the world and the lifeline of the Chinese economy and the American global influence. Neither Beijing, the regional Asian countries, or Washington can afford to back down. American top diplomats have publicly stated that the United States will fly, sail, and operate wherever international law allows it. This coincides with the arbitration request by the Philippines to the tribunal in The Hague. China is refusing to participate or even accept the court's jurisdiction, but the decision by the tribunal will redefine international law, and Washington will attempt to use this new international law to reduce the Chinese presence. A decision on this matter is expected in 2016. In South Asia, the focus will be on India. In order to maintain the high economic growth projections, India is in need of reforms. Prime Minister Modi is well aware of this, and in fact he has proposed a list of reforms which include taxation, labor rights, real estate, etc. However, the biggest obstacle for the government is the federal structure of the country. Some Indian states, such as Delhi and Bihar, will try to prevent the reforms because the local interests clash with the national interests. Yet, despite the internal politics and the inefficient bureaucracy, the low oil prices will help to sustain the economic growth projection of 7% into 2016. As for New Delhi's foreign policy, the country will try to stabilize its relations with neighboring Nepal. The dispute between the two erupted when Nepal adjusted the constitution, in which the Hindu-based ethnic Madhesi community was left out in proportional representation. In protest, the Madhesi faction imposed a blockade. Following this, Nepal accused India of organizing the blockade due to the cross-border Hindu solidarity. In 2016, the relations between the two countries will recover, but Nepal will gradually reach out to China for leverage against India. In the long term, this will significantly weaken the geopolitical position of India, as China already has close relations with neighboring Pakistan and Sri Lanka. Further west in Pakistan, the low oil prices and the IMF loan will stimulate economic growth for 2016. Islamabad will continue to pursue a number of regional projects, including the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. This $46 billion mega project is intended to link the Pakistani Khwadar port to China's Xinjiang region through a vast network of highways and railways. The strategic leverage of this mega project will remain a top priority for both Beijing and Islamabad. Moreover, Pakistan will continue to serve as a mediator in the Afghan-Taliban peace talks, but no results are expected for this year. As for the relations between India and Pakistan, there will be skirmishes along the front line, but all in all, the relations will be as stable as they can be. Moving on to some good news in South America. Most countries in the continent have a stable year ahead. Bolivia will hold a national referendum to extend the rule of President Morales for a third term. And Peru will use its public sector to compensate for the drop in economic growth, which is the result of low metal prices. But the remarkable news is in Colombia. The peace talks between the government and the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia have reached a number of important breakthroughs. President Santos is on the brink of ending a 50-year insurgency which has claimed the lives of roughly 220,000 people. However, there's a catch. The reaction of the country's second-largest rebel movement is unpredictable. The communist-based National Liberation Army may feel threatened and thus increase attacks to disrupt the peace talks. So in order to fully end the insurgencies, Santos' administration must engage in negotiations with both rebel groups simultaneously. Neighboring Venezuela will face a rough year. The country already had deep-rooted currency problems, but the low oil prices have accelerated the crisis. Caracas will begin the year with depleted foreign reserves, which will force the government to reduce public spending and imports. As a result, the national currency will decline in value, inflation will rise, and the shortages of commodities will increase. This will lead to social unrest throughout the country. To sum things up, the country is broke, and in 2016, Venezuela will be one step closer to default on its $120 billion foreign debt. Further south in Brazil, the country will also face an economic crisis brought forth not by the low oil prices, but by the low commodity prices. Brazil's economic reliance on the export of commodities will slow down economic growth. In the past 3 years, the total value of Brazilian exports has decreased by 13%, and this trend will continue in 2016. And even though the government is trying to figure out ways to keep inflation and unemployment down, there simply is no quick fix for the country. What makes this economic crisis worse is the ongoing political crisis. Ever since the 2014 Petrobras corruption scandal, the financial and construction sectors have suffered. And the fallout of the Petrobras scandal is so widespread that it has even damaged the image of President Rousseff. Her approval rates stand at an all-time low, barely 10%, and there are even serious calls for her impeachment. Over the course of 2016, this uncertain political environment will feed the economic crisis. The same story goes for Argentina, where President Macri will start to address the ongoing political problems that are the legacy of the 1998 Great Depression. The government is planning to reduce public spending, devalue the currency, and negotiate with creditors on the national debt. Macri will also look to China to secure loans to implement the necessary reforms. However, despite his best efforts, the president will not be able to solve all the debt problems or prevent high inflation. In North America, little will change for Mexico and Canada. Compared to 2015, this year the political arena will be more stable in Mexico. The government will be able to handle the low oil prices, and despite the high levels of criminal activity, the country will continue to attract investors. Canada will start to recover from the 2015 recession, which is largely driven by the low oil prices. The upside for Canada is that since almost 80% of Canadians are employed in the services sector, the common citizens have not and will not feel the burdens of the recession. As for the geopolitics of Canada and Mexico, no changes will take place. Both countries have long ago adjusted their foreign policies to that of America. As for the United States, it will be business as usual. Racial violence will continue, and so will the threat of terrorism. The only significant event will be the presidential elections, and despite all the hype concerning the elections, the next American president will not be able to drastically alter the geopolitical position of the country, even if he or she desperately wanted it to. What we must realize is that the United States has roughly 700 formal military bases throughout the world. Washington cannot simply withdraw from these regions without setting in motion a domino effect with tremendous consequences. In 2016, the geopolitics of the world's sole superpower will be evidently focused on the outside. In Europe, Washington will dedicate resources to the East European NATO members in an attempt to halt the influence of Russia. In the Middle East, the United States will support the Turkish-Saudi endeavors in Syria, while at the same time show support to the Kurdish militant groups. In Southeast and East Asia, Washington will seek to use the regional countries to counter the growing influence of China. This will be achieved through means of military and financial support packages. In short, over the course of 2016, the United States will promote its interests not through military force, but by stimulating a balance of power within regions. However, the thing is, America is so overstretched that the divide and rule strategy will hit some speed bumps along the road. And as the saying goes, he who defends everything defends nothing. So Washington will have to prioritize its long-term strategy. The truth is that for the upcoming years, the growing Chinese presence and the rise of Russia are the two biggest threats to American interests. All in all, 2016 will most likely bring more momentum through the various military confrontations, and addressing these issues will require something that many governments lack: patience, creative diplomacy, and courage to act. However, not everything is bleak. Sometimes there is common ground. The Iranian nuclear deal, progress in the Myanmar democratic transition, and the agreement on climate change are examples. But anything worth achieving requires vigilance and awareness. The mentioned subjects in this report and in part 1 are in need of international attention. Anyway, this was a Caspian report by me, Shirvan. I just want to extend my gratitude to the following people for their contributions on Patreon. And if you would like to support Caspian Report in creating more content like this, please visit our Patreon page in the description. For now, thank you for watching, take care and sağ ol.